the previous lesson, we discussed how psychology has evolved into a powerful and intricate academic system. The 6 major schools of thought we introduced earlier have had significant influence, and there are many other branches and theories within the field. It's been estimated that there are over 1,000 psychological therapies worldwide. In my view, this diversity is both an achievement and a challenge for psychology. With so many guiding methods, there's a risk that some may be unreliable or go beyond necessary limits, providing little to no help and potentially causing harm. For an ordinary person navigating the complex landscape of psychological disciplines, how can one discern which approaches are more reliable and exercise caution? I have a suggestion. You can ask a simple question: has this viewpoint been empirically validated? Empirical, as the name suggests, means that any viewpoint needs evidence for verification. This is a widely recognized research standard in mainstream psychology. We share a consensus that empirically validated viewpoints are more likely to be reliable than those lacking validation. But what exactly is empirical research? Empirical research is rooted in a crucial attitude: restraint. Restraint means refraining from saying things that shouldn't be said and not meddling in things that shouldn't be meddled with. It aims to ensure that psychology doesn't just say more things but that everything said in the name of psychology stands up to scrutiny. How do you go about this? First, you need to understand a concept called the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is a voice specifically challenging researchers. Its basic logic is, when a researcher proposes a new theory, no matter how reasonable it sounds, it's merely a hypothesis. There's an opposing hypothesis saying, not necessarily, or maybe you're overthinking it. How do you overcome the null hypothesis? Only by presenting evidence that silences it. For instance, if you observe that people feel happier after consuming high-sugar foods, you might want to propose a general rule. The null hypothesis challenges, not necessarily, what if this is just a coincidence? You argue that all your friends experience the same. The null hypothesis counters, maybe that's just a coincidence, your friends might not be normal. This may sound a bit forceful, but when you're advocating a new conclusion, your position is inherently unequal to the null hypothesis. To reject a new theory isn't a serious consequence, life continues as usual. However, accepting your hypothesis requires the world to acknowledge a new theory that didn't exist before, and if that goes wrong, the consequences could be severe. This is the significance of the null hypothesis. How do you make the null hypothesis yield? Empirical researchers have reached a consensus: the conclusion should not only be useful for you but also for as many people as possible. Recruit dozens or hundreds of participants, replicate the conclusion. If it holds true for everyone you've recruited, then it's plausible. The specific process involves 4 steps: random assignment, controlling variables, statistical significance, and replication. Let's start with random assignment. If you want to prove that sugar improves mood, you need to randomly assign your participants to 2 groups, one that eats sugar and one that doesn't, and then compare their mood changes. It's crucial to ensure that the assignment process is truly random. Regardless of age, gender, education, or income, there should be an equal probability of entering either the sugar-eating or non-sugar-eating group. If the sugar-eating group is consistently happier, the null hypothesis has nothing to challenge. But if you use a non-random grouping method, such as having participants who come in the morning eat sugar and those who come in the afternoon abstain, the null hypothesis might argue, maybe it's the morning sunlight that uplifts their mood. Only with complete randomness can the null hypothesis be silenced. However, the null hypothesis can find other grounds for objection. If there are no issues with random assignment, it might switch tactics. The people who ate sugar are happy not because of the sugar but simply because they ate something. Or it could make an even more audacious claim: once they taste something sweet, they receive a psychological suggestion that they should be happy. It has nothing to do with actual sugar content. To counter these objections, you need to consider another point: controlling variables. This involves precisely setting differences between groups, excluding other variables that could interfere. For example, both groups should eat foods with the same quantity, appearance, and taste, but one group's food contains sugar, and the other's contains a sugar substitute. The participants shouldn't know which type they're consuming. This is called a single-blind experiment, common in psychological research. Only then can you conclude that the mood difference between the two groups is unrelated to other factors and is genuinely caused by sugar intake. With such evidence, can the null hypothesis still object? Its last resort might be a statistical argument. Maybe the difference between the two groups isn't that significant, it's just random fluctuations in the data. This is a bit tricky because it's a possibility that can never be completely ruled out. How do you respond? You step back and say, the two groups don't differ, what we observed is merely random fluctuation. This possibility does exist, but the probability is so low that we don't need to take it seriously. How low is low enough? The commonly agreed upon rule is, if it's below 5%, it's acceptable. This can be calculated using statistical methods, and the smaller the probability, the better, but as long as it's below 5%, it's considered statistically significant. At this point, you've officially breached the defenses of the null hypothesis and can assert, sugar improves mood. This is not just my personal observation or speculation, it's likely a general rule applicable to most people. However, you might still worry, isn't a 5% probability still somewhat high? Could this be a misjudgment due to random fluctuations? This question can't be answered by a single study, the conclusion needs to undergo repeated verification. When publishing a study, researchers provide detailed experimental procedures, implicitly conveying their openness to potential replication. If someone is willing to replicate the experiment under similar conditions and observe similar results, the credibility of the study increases. In fact, most classical conclusions in the field of psychology have undergone more than one round of replication. This is the standard process of empirical research, with 4 key steps: random assignment, controlling variables, statistical significance, and replication. Today, any psychological theory aspiring for widespread acceptance must undergo this rigorous process. Does empirical research stifle creativity? To be honest, in the face of such a rigorous empirical research system, the position of psychological researchers can be quite humble. I recall my days in the psychology department at university, where the fear of being dictated by the 5% threshold was pervasive. I remember a classmate mumbling in their sleep, "Grant me a 0.05 significance." Only with statistical significance can research be published and become an accepted conclusion in the academic community. We often wonder, if Freud had needed empirical testing and statistical significance to publish his papers, perhaps psychoanalysis would never have emerged as a doctrine. You might be curious, does mainstream empirical research stifle the creativity of many psychologists? Is a conclusion deemed unreliable if it hasn't undergone empirical validation? On this issue, I currently hold the following opinion. In today's context, everyone can engage with psychology, but not all individuals are the same when it comes to psychology. During my university days, would encounter people on campus often referred to as amateur scientists. These individuals lacked formal scientific education and attempted to promote self-imagined theories in physics or mathematics to the research community. Scientific standards are high, and those outside this threshold struggle to provide valuable insights based solely on inspiration. However, psychology operates differently. If an amateur psychologist proposes a set of viewpoints based on their intuition, experience, or speculation, there might be some merit in those views. I know someone who battled depression and claimed that philosophy, rather than medication, was the key to his recovery. He wanted to share his insights through writing books or teaching online to help others like him. I support his initiative. But what if he were to assert, my method A is the only way for all depression patients, or depression shouldn't be treated with medication, studying philosophy is the more effective approach? This would be unacceptable. Note that this is not a rejection of his conclusion. He may be correct, but it's only a possibility. At this stage, he can only say, it worked for me, and it might work for others, or it might not. This is essentially what most psychologists did in the past, and the role of empirical researchers is to scrutinize these claims. For instance, humanistic psychology existed in the 1960s and 1970s as a beautiful idea, but its universal applicability was uncertain until after the 21st century when empirical research started proving these speculations. This is what led to the emergence of positive psychology today. So, in my view, there are 2 kinds of psychologists: those who propose hypotheses and those who verify them. Both you and I can freely propose hypotheses based on personal experiences, but to generalize them, empirical evidence is necessary. Today, there are thousands of psychological therapies worldwide, and many people have solved their psychological problems through various methods. Still, if I were to recommend, would lean towards mainstream methods that have undergone empirical testing. It might not be the best, but at least its effectiveness can be anticipated. In many countries, insurance companies only pay for treatment programs with empirical data. There might be therapists claiming to have better therapies, but if they can't prove it through empirical research, common reasons include each visitor being unique, requiring a personalized approach. While this is a valid point, if someone asked me,